Yes, our next, we are continuing in session 3 on more living donor transplant issues. Our next speaker is Marcia Gershun, MBA. She is the co-author of a wonderful, fairly recent book, Kidney to Share. I must say, I read it to cover and in one sitting, and she is among our other speakers here as a living donor. And she's going to be speaking on the experiences of being a living donor. Martha, the stage is yours.
Phil, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to join this remarkable group of people, many of whom I have watched and read and listened to and learned from in this journey. I think in a lot of ways, I am the case. I am the case for the difficulty of being a living kidney donor, and I am the case for the extraordinary benefits and the extraordinary meaning in a living kidney donor. You all have heard most of the numbers today, and I know most of you wrote the numbers or counted the numbers or have kept track of the numbers for your academic lives. But for me, the most interesting number is that last year, only 1,958 people in our entire country gave a kidney to someone that they were not related to. And I am one of those people. Some of those were anonymous donations. Mine was what is called an altruistic living kidney donation, and then it switched. And by that, I mean I did not know the woman I donated to. And then through the process, the very long 9-month process of donating, we got to know each other and became friends and have a post-transplant relationship. But I get to claim the altruistic kidney button category because when I first offered, I didn't know her yet. So let me introduce you. This is Deb Porter-Gill. She is the pretty blonde on the left-hand side. Deb had received a kidney pancreas transplant in her 30s when she was in law school. And 20 years later, the kidney was failing. That was from a cadaveric donor. Of course, you can't get a pancreas easily from a living donor. And I read about Deb in our local newspaper, in the Kansas City Jewish Chronicle. And her story spoke to me. Like many people who altruistically donate or donate even to a family member, I had a kidney story in my own family. A beloved cousin had polycystic kidney disease, had needed a kidney, had received a living donation from a close family friend. And so I am someone who, as a family member, benefited from someone's extraordinary act of altruism. I had 9 more years with my cousin. And so I knew what this could mean to a family, and I wanted to try. In some ways, it was the most rewarding experience of my life, but it was so much harder than I expected. Not harder medically. I went to the Mayo Clinic. That's where my recipient was registered. And I got the most extraordinary medical care of my life. I really learned what it means to be part of a major medical center with phenomenal care. But the logistics, the psychosocial and stigma barriers, and the financial barriers, which we are talking about some today, were significant. I ended up writing a book about it. I was so frustrated. I'm a Harvard MBA with a career in customer experience and social operations, and so it made me crazy that this could not be easier. But also, I've spent part of my career in the nonprofit sector, primarily working with families living in poverty. And it was very clear to me that the obstacles which I was routinely asked to hop over in order to do this good thing called donate a kidney were even possible because I am educated, because my husband and I have money in the bank, because I have a credit card that I can put charges on, because I speak English as a first language, I think quite possibly because I am white, and came to believe that if we do not find a way to reduce these barriers, we will permanently limit the people who can donate a kidney. Now, I don't think the world owes me or anybody like me the right to do this great volunteer thing that made me feel terrific and made me really happy and fulfilled. But I do think we have a right, we owe people the right to save their relatives, to save their parents, to save their siblings, to save their children. And I think our current obstacles really get in the way. My book tells a lot of the stories, and I am not going to regale you with them, but I'm going to tell you about one of the most ridiculous. On the original intake form on the computer, I answered a trick question. The trick question is, have you ever used recreational drugs? Well, I have to confess, I'm a 65-year-old woman who's had a life. And yes, in my life, I have smoked recreational marijuana, which at the time of my donation was legal in 8 states and legal in the District of Columbia. And so I answered yes. That was a red flag, and it set off all these other downstream things, the most significant of which is that the Mayo Clinic would not even test my blood for HLA tissue typing until I agreed to see a substance abuse counselor. I said, sure, I'll see a substance abuse counselor. Might even be fun. And anyway, I wasn't going to let that keep me from saving Deb's life. But then it turned out they didn't have any available appointments for substance abuse counselors. So my husband and I, who drove 6 hours from our home in Kansas City to spend 3 days in Rochester, Minnesota, where I went through 25 medical and evaluation appointments to be sure I was fit physically and mentally to donate a kidney, couldn't get a substance abuse appointment. They wanted me to drive back at my own expense. Remember, travel expenses are not covered unless you're low income enough to fall into the NLDAC category. For this one-hour appointment, because I said now and then I smoked a joint. I talked my way out of that appointment. I was very impassioned, but you can't help wonder, is that because I'm articulate, because I'm a good advocate, because I'm a more than middle-aged woman, because I'm white? Is that the kind of barrier that would keep a 33-year-old Black guy with dreads from donating to his mother? I have to believe that happens. In the end, our experience, which took 9 months, literally to the day, start to finish, from the day I called the Mayo Clinic to the day we were on the transplant floor on the table, my husband and I spent over $5,000 in travel and other expenses, hotels, food, car, cat sitter. Would have been much more if we still had children at home and needed childcare, which we did not. And I was already retired, so I had no lost wages. But my husband, who was employed, missed 16 days of work to be my caregiver. Now, Don's an executive of a nonprofit. That was PTO. His board was thrilled that he was doing this for a member of our Jewish community. But again, a gig worker, someone who's holding down 3 fast food jobs to feed their family. Don't forget, it's not just the recipient. These transplant clinics require a caregiver with them for both the evaluation and the surgery and the recovery. And so I was listening to the talk about financially neutral. There is nothing neutral about this process. Even if we had been reimbursed the $5,000, and we were, Deb Porter-Gill's family reimbursed my family, which was lovely, not required, but just lovely. It was all on our credit card. How many low-income people have $5,000 worth of credit card debt? So what are the real-world outcomes? Well, you all know it means that only 15% of people who start the process to become a living kidney donor go all the way. Many are disqualified for medical reasons, but many for the barriers that I encountered. We have people who want to do this, and we are making it too hard. So just so you can see, here's our happy ending. There's Deb and me the day after surgery when I was walking, but she wasn't yet. And I went down to her room in the hospital. And there we are a year later. She took me out for sushi. We decided that didn't violate any rules about a reward, that you actually could give someone free sushi if they gave you a kidney. And we stay in touch. She is healthy. She survived COVID in Florida. 3 years out, I'm healthy with great kidney function. Deb and I are an example of how wonderful this process can be, and also an example of why it is too hard. Thanks.
Thank you, Martha. Wonderful presentation, and congratulations on your book and you're a great indicator of generosity and love. Our next speaker is Thomas Peters, MD. Thomas is at the University of Florida, and was one of the first. In fact, I think he was the first surgeon to come out to advocating, to gifting, and caring for the donors. And a little background: he was actually in Gulf War I when his article on that was accepted. So Thomas has a lot of stories. He was chief MASH surgeon in the Gulf War I. Anyway, one of the big things I learned in setting this program up is I had no idea that there is as much support in the public for compensating donors. Dr. Peters, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Phil. It's a pleasure to be here, and hello everybody from Jacksonville, Florida. An earlier slide did show a depiction of the abstract of the paper about which I'm going to speak this afternoon. It was published in JAMA Surgery some 5 or 6 years ago, and I have no conflicts. I show this in order to give credit to my co-authors and also then to allow anyone to see the reference at the bottom of the page. Compensation for organ donation, of course, raises a number of issues. We've heard them today. They're legal, issues of fairness, religious or moral ethical matters, and others. The other thing I think we've heard is that there are millions of potential U.S. living kidney donors, healthy people walking around in America, and use of a kidney from such a person or many persons could save huge sums of money in the care of end-stage renal disease. And I think we've also heard that many decades of studies and publications have also explored this issue. When we looked at this several years ago, there had been no prior assessment of what U.S. voters thought. And so a study was designed to determine what U.S. voters might think of compensating living kidney donors. And this is what compensation is not. A recent article in the Wall Street Journal about Afghans selling kidneys. And I want to emphasize that we are talking in this survey about a regulated, government-controlled payment for a kidney, much like there is control of Social Security, military retirement pay, and so on. So when we started the study, the top graph shows that there were 16,000 kidney transplants annually. That number had not increased over the course of a decade. And there was an increase from 6,000 to nearly 8,000 people dying or being removed from the transplant list because they were too sick. And the lower graph shows that during that period, the need for kidneys was increasing based on numbers on the waiting list. And so our objectives were to determine the willingness of U.S. voters to become living kidney donors. And we wanted to also ascertain the influence of compensation on those people answering a survey. The survey was designed by Penn Shane Berland, a rather notable international Washington, D.C. polling firm. It was a quantitative nationwide phone survey, initially involving 16,800 people, from which 1,011 were chosen because they represented the cross-section of U.S. voters. And the questions were asked, as you can see in bold: do you agree? Do you strongly agree, somewhat agree, and so on? These questions were compiled and assessed. So the good news is 68% of these 1,000 U.S. voters would donate to anybody. That was their initial response. And 23% would donate to certain persons, usually a relative or a friend. Only 9% of those selected out of potential U.S. voters likely to vote would not donate. Now, I realize this is a busy slide with numbers, but if you look at the left-hand vertical column, that really defines the U.S. voting population. For example, under age, you can see that 43% of our cohort was aged 45 to 64, and in the employment status, 49% were employed and 32% were retired. And so this is really what the United States kind of looks like. Now, if we add a question, would $50,000 payment affect your willingness to donate? And other interesting findings, 60% of those willing to donate to anyone at a baseline and 60% of those willing to donate to a family and friend at baseline would be more willing to donate. And very few persons in any of these groups said that a financial incentive would make them less willing to donate a kidney. So the bottom line here on the total line at the bottom of this page is that of the 1,011 individuals polled, 59% would be more willing, 9% would be less willing, and there would be no change in 30% of those who were asked, would compensation, the effect of compensation on your willingness to donate. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit here and look at the principle of compensating living kidney donors. We were able to ask 635 respondents, do you agree that compensating living kidney donors is something that should be done? And what we found was that this question in principle did vary a little bit in terms of those willing to donate to anyone felt this was a suitable principle in 2/3 of cases, whereas those unwilling to donate thought that it was a principle to agree with in only 43% of cases. But we subjected these data to statistical analysis, and I want to show you a summary slide on that rather than talk about all of the minutiae in the numbers. So voters willing to donate to anyone favor compensation 66% more than restricted family and friend or restricted donation respondents. But those restricted donation respondents disfavor living donor compensation more than their counterparts who are willing to donate to anyone. However, the interesting thing in this circumstance is that still 53% of family, friend, and 43% of non-donors favor the principle of compensating living kidney donors. In terms of age, as you might expect, younger age voters would favor compensation more, older perhaps not so much, but in the end, 61% of all people asked this question favored the principle of compensating living kidney donors. Now, I'll talk you through this slide a little bit. This was taken a week or two ago from UNOS data. If you look at the left-hand column under the year 2021, you can see that 24,671 kidney transplants were done last year. 5,972 were from living donors. And if you look all the way to the right, 10 years before, 5,619 living donors were done. So despite the fact that there's been a substantial increase in kidney transplantation overall, from 16,000, which was evident when we started our study, to 24,000 now, there has not been a substantial increase in living kidney donors. So the key points were really that most people would donate, but actually not many come forward to do that. However, they would be more willing to donate were there compensation involved? And so we conclude, as has been discussed earlier today, that that probably these survey results suggest public support to modify restrictive laws so that studies of financial incentives for living kidney donors could be undertaken, as Doctors Emeritus and Sattel have said, and as I agree. So I will close with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. Tell me it's not true that Alan Alta has asked you to play in a replay of the, what was the MASH unit? So our next speaker is Arthur Emeritus. He was very emphatic to me. He did not want a long introduction. I will just say that he's a very humble and capable man. I had read that he had 950 published articles, and he put me down and said, "Oh no, I don't have anything like that. I only have 750 peer-reviewed published articles." Dr. Emeritus, the floor is yours.
So the talk I'm giving is on safeguards and risks for donors. Just to start with safeguards, the safeguards that are in place include education, which include education about process, risks, the surgery and recovery, a thorough medical and psychosocial evaluation, well-defined acceptance criteria, including wanting to donate, completely healthy with 2 kidneys and normal renal function, no communicable disease, and no psychosocial problems that would impact recovery and long-term outcomes. And with all of that, informed consent. And of note, guidelines about acceptance and evaluation have been developed by numerous national societies. In terms of risks, the surgical risks and the data is based on highly selected donors, as we talked about, without significant comorbidities and minimal operative risks. And the risks are small, but they're real. There's a 3 in 10,000 chance of dying from the donor operation, a major morbidity about 1 to 2%, and overall about 7%. The real concern are the long-term outcomes of donors. First, in terms of cardiovascular disease and death. We know that in the general population, even a small decrease in kidney function is associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease and death. But also in the general population, loss of kidney function is due to kidney or systemic disease, whereas in donors, it's due to the removal of 1 kidney. The second concern is chronic kidney disease and kidney failure. Again, in the general population, there's a decrease in kidney function with aging, and this seems to start about middle age. There's a concern in donors that this decrease or other impact of nephrectomy would lead to kidney disease or kidney failure. There have been a couple of intermediate-term prospective studies of donors versus healthy controls. The first by Kasiski et al., 200 donors, 200 healthy controls, followed up to 9 years. And from 6 months to 9 years, kidney function was stable in the donors, but declined in the controls. There was no difference between groups in blood pressure, urine protein, urine albumin, glucose, hemoglobin A1C, insulin, or lipoproteins. There were some metabolic abnormalities of unknown significance at that time. A second study by Price, 50 donors, 50 and 45 matched healthy controls, followed for 5 years. No difference between donors and controls in blood pressure, left ventricular mass, or other parameters of cardiac function. Thinking about truly long-term, there have been no prospective studies of mortality, cardiovascular disease, or kidney failure. Worldwide, certainly, a number of retrospective studies have compared donors to the general population and not identified any increased donor risk. But donors are selected from the general population. If we were really going to do the ideal retrospective study, you would match donors with those approved for donation, but not donating. But the numbers are really too small to do this. The best alternative would be to match donors with controls from the same era, same geographic area and socioeconomic status, completely healthy with normal kidney function at the date corresponding to the date of donation, matched on known risk factors for cardiovascular disease or kidney disease, such as a family history of kidney disease or BMI, and have decades of follow-up. In reality, to date, there's not been a single study meeting these criteria. In terms of retrospective studies on mortality and cardiovascular disease, there have been a number of studies with 10 years or less follow-up finding no difference in mortality between donors and controls, and a single study from Norway in which 1,900 donors were compared to 32,000 healthy controls with a median follow-up of 15 years and finding increased mortality and cardiovascular disease. The authors suggested their data was different than the others because they had followed the donors for longer. And you can see at the bottom right of the screen, when they looked at mortality between the two groups, the curves diverged at 15 years after donation. And they suggested this might explain the difference in results. However, there have been numerous reviews and meta-analyses, including these studies and others, and each of them concluding, as shown in the two reviews on this slide, no evidence of increased risk for all-cause mortality or cardiovascular disease after living donation. Turning to kidney disease, the same Norwegian studies comparing the 1,900 donors to the 32,000 controls. In that study, there were 9 donors who developed kidney disease. That's an absolute risk of 0.47%, so very small. But the authors concluded there was an increased relative risk compared to the controls. A second study from the United States, 99 donors with kidney failure out of 96,000, an absolute risk of 0.1%. But again, a relative risk of kidney failure increased versus the non-donors in this study. There are numerous limitations to these two studies, including a low event rate, wide confidence interval. The control groups weren't from the same era or geographic era. There were statistical techniques that have been questioned, confounding factors. There are different methods used for ascertaining end-stage kidney disease in the donors versus the controls, and a very comprehensive review of these two studies found key differences in data quality, follow-up, duration, and statistical analysis. A huge problem to me, however, is that these two studies weren't controlled for family history. In the Norwegian study, all 9 donors developing kidney failure were first-degree relatives of the recipient. In the US study, 83 out of the 99 were related to the recipient. And we know that in the general population, kidney failure is increased in relative of individuals with kidney failure, and the greatest increase is in first-degree relatives. So the risk may be actually being a relative who then is a donor as compared to just a donor. And this increased risk of relatives as donors is shown in the United States database in that of donors developing kidney failure, although the total number is small, the highest risk was in identical twins and the second highest in first-degree relatives, whereas more distant relatives had a much, much lower risk, the same as unrelated donors. In terms of the overall national database, from 1988 to 2020, there were 164 living donor transplants. During the same time period, 633 living donors, that's 0.4%, have developed kidney failure, suggesting that at worst, the risk is very small. Limitation of this data is we may not have followed the donors long enough. But there's another problem with the data, and that is, are all the donors to date highly selected? And this can be seen in a paper recently published in the Journal of American Medical Association on 75 donors developing kidney failure out of 71,000. And the authors looked at the kidney function prior to donation and the kidney function 6 months after donation. And you can see at the left-hand side in the graph at the bottom, the kidney function prior to donation. The criterion that's accepted for kidney function prior to donation is EGFR, that's a measurement of kidney function, of 80 or above. And you can see from this slide that a significant proportion of these donors at the time of donation had their kidney function was below this accepted criterion. On the right-hand side, again, the kidney function 6 months after donation in a significant proportion of donors was much lower than we would have expected if the national standards had been used in acceptance for these donors. The lack of data and evidence is shown in the recent 2017 KDIGO guidelines, which said, consistent, transparent, and defensible decision-making to accept or decline a living kidney donor candidate has been limited by the lack of an evidence-based means to provide quantitative estimates of post-donation risk. We know that the risk is not the same for all. We know that risk factors identified in the general population for cardiovascular disease or kidney disease are the same as those identified in donors. For example, high BMI is a risk in donors, just as it is in the general population. And there's currently studies on the risk of apolipoprotein 1, which is a genetic factor, which is shown to be a risk in the general population, currently being studied in donors. Well, you can ask, how do donors develop end-stage kidney disease? And this cartoon gives you two possible reasons. This looks at years post-donation versus kidney function. As I mentioned, there's a deterioration of kidney function with normal aging beginning in about middle age. And at the top in the white, you could hypothesize that this would be a curve showing the normal deterioration. If you take a kidney out, the donor would start with less kidney function in the blue, as they had in middle age, and then you would have a deterioration of function, which might reach kidney failure sooner than if they had two kidneys. An alternate explanation in the red is that once a kidney is taken out, the donor has normal deterioration of function, but then there's new onset disease, resulting in a much more rapid decline in kidney function and leading to end-stage kidney disease. The first study to look at this was by Keto in Japan, who looked at 8 donors developing kidney failure. And in fact, the kidney function was stable until new onset disease. And we've looked at this ourselves in our own population with much larger numbers and seen the exact same phenomenon. Kidney function remained normal after donation until until development of new onset disease. This is important because the two most causes of kidney failure in donors are the same as those seen in the general population, and that is type 2 diabetes and hypertension. These are diseases of aging, but there are also diseases of lifestyle. And so to me, this means that being a kidney donor ought to come with a commitment to a healthy lifestyle. There's an additional medical risk, and that is a risk concerned with pregnancy. We know that in the general population, reduced kidney function is associated with adverse outcomes for both the mother and the fetus. There have been 3 major studies on this in kidney donors, all showing no increased risk for the fetus, and the only increase for the mother was an increased risk of hypertension and preeclampsia, which means, again, that if somebody chooses to be a donor, to have pregnancy after donation, they need to tell their OB person that they're at high risk for high blood pressure and have their blood pressure monitored more rapidly. Just finally, to turn to long-term psychosocial outcomes, the quality of life in donors is the same or better than in the general population. There's about 4% regret. And the 2 major risk factors are donor complication or the recipient rapidly losing their graft. Risk factors for poor psychosocial complications or outcomes have been shown on this slide, and it's important to know this in terms of the evaluation, because certainly if history of psychiatric or psychological difficulties is a risk, and you can see the other risks, including, again, donor complications, recipient graft failure on this slide. Just finally turning to non-directed donors, because non-directed donors don't know the recipient, and so they don't have the benefit of seeing the recipient do well. And so this is the closest that one would come to our potentially incentivized donors. And the outcome is exactly the same in conventional donors. Non-directed donors stress about the possibility of recipient kidney rejection, physical consequences to themselves, and financial burden. In the study with long-term follow-up, only 1.2% expressed regret. 97% said they would do it again. So to summarize, with current evaluation and selection, surgical risk is low. Kidney donors have the same risk factors for death or kidney disease as the general population. There's concern about a very small increase of kidney failure in donors, but the supporting data is poor. Donation should come with a commitment to a healthy lifestyle, and risk factors for poor psychosocial outcome have been defined. And perhaps most important, quality studies on long-term outcome are needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful presentation. Very complicated, and I do repeat that it will be available to have an audio, video record of all this that you will be eligible to receive. Without further ado, we'll go to hear from Dr. John P. Roberts, who will give us some notion of the limits of the increased counts of deceased donor transplants. John started with me by saying there's a lot of ignorance in this field, and I'd like to speak about it. Thank you. John, you're on stage.
Hi, I'm John Roberts. I'm a professor of surgery at the University of California, San Francisco, and I do liver and kidney transplantations. Phil asked me to talk about the limits of increased counts of deceased donor transplants for the conference. So at UCSF, you can see this is the number of people that we put on the kidney transplant wait list each year, and you can see we roughly put on about 1,000 patients a year. We're pretty liberal about which patients we put on the transplant waiting list because our waiting times run in the 7 to 10 year range, and there's no reason to do a lot of workup for a patient who would have to repeat it 5 years later. So we have been relatively liberal in doing that. It's sort of there's a whole background behind what, and we could spend a long time talking about that. So this is how many patients we remove every year without a transplant. You can see here in the 2010 range. So those are patients who would be listed in 2010 and before, and you can see about 60% of those patients are removed without transplant. So if you look at that fall off over from 2010 to 2019, that's really how many patients are removed on a yearly basis without transplant. But when you go, say, to 2010, there's maybe one patient or two patients left on the waiting list. So that's sort of the earlier times are sort of what it looks like in terms of all patients who are on the waiting list. And then the slope is basically how many people we remove per year. So this is a comparison of, our fractions of deceased donor liver transplants, kidney transplants and deceased donor and living donor kidney transplant is compared to wait list removal. And you can sort of see that, there's not a lot of change over time, and that, about 40% of the patients get a transplant. If you think about it, though, if about 15 to 20% of these people are getting living donor transplants, so the chances of you getting a deceased donor transplant is roughly in the, say, 25% range. So that of all the patients we list, if you don't have a living donor transplant, you only have about a 25% chance of getting deceased donor transplant. And if you're diabetic, the odds are much worse because people with diabetes don't do well on the waiting list. And so it's probably about 10% of those patients end up getting a deceased donor kidney transplant. Just compare this to the U.S. So this is the number of patients who are added to the wait list every year. And I think, as Frank probably points out, there's maybe a lot more patients, maybe twice this number, that could be added. Not exactly clear that number, but this is the actual number. So about 35 to 40,000 patients go on the wait list every year. And then these are the percentage of patients who are removed without transplant. This is not sort of that log that we keep. This is just how many patients are put on the wait list and how many percent of patients are taken off the wait list without a transplant on a yearly basis. So then here's the people that are removed from the wait list, the people that get living donor transplant, which has really been relatively stable. There has been an increase in the number of people getting deceased donor kidney transplant, which is really thought to be related to the opioid crisis and the increased number of donors related to that. So here's the number of U.S. candidates who are removed without transplant every year. You can see that number runs around 12,000 or so of people that are put on the wait list and who are removed without a transplant every year. So that's what you would think, well, that's kind of how many more kidney transplants we could use on a yearly basis. One of the things to do is to kind of look and see, well, who's really doing this well, and with the idea that maybe if we were able to reach a higher metric, we could do more deceased donor kidney transplant. And here's Spain, and let's just look at 2019, 2020. Obviously, was affected by COVID, but you can see that Spain is quite a bit ahead of the United States, who is the second in the world in terms of deceased donors per million transplants. But Spain, has really done really well being ahead of us and the rest of the world in this category. So if you look at U.S. versus Spain donors per million population, this just sort of lays it out in numbers, and you can see that, here's almost 50 donors per million population, and here we're at 36.1 in the U.S. So, if we thought about, well, what if we did that close to 50,000 donors per million population, what would it look like? And you can see over here on the right-hand side that we would increase our number of donors by about 16,000, a significant increase in the number of donors that we would expect. So this would, if you look at sort of the what would happen in terms of kidney transplantation, we would have an additional deceased donors of about 5,000 kidney transplants. And so how does Spain get to that 50 donors per million population? Jeff Halderson and I looked at this a number of years ago in terms of just looking at the donor age of Spain versus the US. And you can see that, let's say, for donors over the age of 70, that Spain actually does really well compared to us for donors over the age of 70, donors over the age of 60 and 70. Now, and this is from 1985 to 2010, but you can look at one of the interesting things is that, Spain, actually, the number of donors in the 15 to 30 range fell off over this time. So Spain actually doesn't do a real good job in terms of, the younger donors or the donors at 35 to 45 in terms of the US. What they really do is use older donors much more than we do. So here, if you look at the change in donor age over time, you can see that that the big increase, this is the greater than 70, has been in the greater than 70-year-olds. The younger donors have been stable to falling, and they've done relatively well in terms of the ages 60 to 70, and then 45 to 59. And just looking at that in another way, you can see there's been over a 200% increase in the donors over the age of 70, whereas the donors 60 to 70, 45 to 59 have increased some, and the younger donors really haven't changed much comparatively. So here's the U.S. donors by age, and a couple things to notice here. First off is that here are the ones that have been increasing, and you can see this is in the 50 to 64-year-old, the 35 to 49, and the 18 to 34-year-old. And we think a lot of this increase has been from the increased numbers of donors from opioids. Interesting, greater than 65 plus. It's not I don't have the same breakout as Spain, but you can see we're doing really small numbers of older donors and much smaller increases compared to Spain. And then you can see that though we have increased in these, we haven't increased very much as compared to what Spain's done. So Spain really has been using older donors to catch up and be ahead of us. So, and they've had to do that because they've been having decreases in some of their younger donors. So if we got to Spain's donor per million, probably 4,000 to 5,000 more kidneys per year, while we would need 12 to 14,000 if we use that removed from the wait list without transplant number. And this change would require a massive increase in the number of donors that we do over the age of 70. One of the things that this is from Spain, looking at older donors, and these are donors after circulatory death rather than brain death. But you can see that the patient survival for the donors over age of 65 and the donors less than 65, and these are at a year, are actually not so good, and probably wouldn't pass muster with the CMS regulations in the United States. This is data looking at sort of combinations, and you can see an elderly donor into an elderly recipient. These are brain dead donors and then DCD donors. You can see that the patient and graft loss is actually fairly significant over 5 years. And so there is a what happens over time is that you end up losing more of these patients than, say, a younger elderly patient who got a younger donor. So these are kind of some of the issues, that would come up in terms of, long-term survival if we used older donors. So in conclusion, in the U.S., there's room to improve the utilization of donors, and this is particularly true in older donors. This increase in the best scenario would decrease the patients removed from the waiting list without transplantation about 35%. And using donors over the age of 70 would require a sea change in U.S. OPO center practices and CMS monitoring. I want to thank the organizers for allowing me to talk at this great symposium.
Thank you very much, John. In lieu of time, I'm going to be very brief. Our next speaker is certainly not being last doesn't make any judgment about him. Josh Morrison, lawyer by training, is a man who really gets things done. He operates out of Washington, D.C. He was the founder of WaitListZero, and he's the fourth in our symposium who was a living kidney donor. He's done all sorts of work to improve donation and all sorts of other aspects of the kidney transplant problem. You don't hear much about him, but he is very, very active in the scenes, in the background. Josh, the stage is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Phil. And you can throw my slides on. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk today. And I was going to basically talk a little bit about the work that we at WaitListZero have done around advocacy for living organ donation, and I think a little bit about why is it that there has not been more progress on reimbursement for donors and other donor benefits. So first, WaitListZero is a group that's run by living donors, and it's meant to kind of give living organ donors more power over the transplant kind of policy domain, so that donors will be treated better and then more people will donate. And then the main idea and thing that we're working on are kind of, so that the big picture goal is this kind of GI Bill for living organ donation. So that's kind of the idea that kidney donors should have the best health care that money can buy, and that means really excellent lifetime health insurance, and it means stipends for making sure that every year people do their follow-up and we get data so we can have better understanding of donor health and donor risks. And we also want to improve transplant education. And the main thing that we're working on now is in New York State, a bill to reimburse living donor expenses. As I'll talk about in a bit, we were able to get the Trump administration to pass a regulation allowing the federal government to reimburse these expenses. But it's been a lot more challenging getting actual funding for that to be at the levels that are really needed. And so these state level campaigns are really helpful and are really necessary to kind of keep things moving. And, if anyone who's on the line has some connections in New York State and wants to help, my email is josh@waitlistZero.org. We could certainly need it before the legislative session ends in June. So as Phil said, I'm a lawyer by training. I'm a kidney donor. I'm a kind of serial social entrepreneur where I founded WaitListZero, Rikers Debate Project, and One Day Sooner. And so the thing I want to talk about today is this question of, well, why is it difficult to get these policies done, right? So there's this problem of, these benefit policies, either, reimbursement, so kind of financial neutrality, which everyone ostensibly agrees upon, or, providing benefits to donors of incentives of health insurance or cash. If those would benefit transplant stakeholders, why do they not actually happen politically? And just to give a really brief background on donor benefits in the U.S., in 2004, you see this law passed under the Bush administration that allows for reimbursement for donors, but only for travel. There's a number of unsuccessful efforts between 2006 and 2019 to do incentives of some kind or to expand that. A lot of the work that I did back in 2018 and 2019 was working with the Trump administration, and particularly Abe Sutton and Adam Bowler, to issue an executive order to expand the Bush bill from travel reimbursement to lost wages and other expenses. But generally, this has been a story of not a lot of progress in the last 20 years. And so this is some language from that executive order. And so I think, what are some, summary points we can make about this history? It's often represented by medical experts. It's usually transplant professional societies. Until recently, there wasn't a lot of, certainly wasn't a lot of push from the National Kidney Foundation, but also not a lot of pharma. I think, the CareDx ImmunoBills campaign, which wasn't about donor benefits, but CareDx is a transplant diagnostics company that put a lot of money into passing a bill covering immunosuppression. That was successful and was very impressive and I think very admirable. But besides that, really not a lot has happened. And the wins that do happen have happened in Republican administrations, but then funding becomes difficult to secure. And you do have some of these other things like the Charlie Norwood Act or the HOPE Act, which are valuable, but not necessarily transformative and not on this kind of donor benefit point. So I'm kind of breaking this problem down, if this would benefit stakeholders, why doesn't it happen? And I think we can think of it in two ways. There's the problem of, well, why don't you get, cash incentives overall? And then why don't you get these less controversial reimbursements that everyone agrees with? And so the first thing on the kind of cash incentives, I think it's a bit of an easier question, which is, okay, well, one thing is obviously that it's controversial. And I think it's inherently controversial because, even though it's something that I'm generally supportive of, it just kind of opposes, our ethics around consequentialism, that we want to, save people's lives, and certain aspects of deontological ethics. I would argue that, the freedom to be able to donate and be able to, and freedom for people who need kidneys, that is a deontological argument. But there's always going to be this concern that you're using someone as a means to an end and kind of treating humans like a sort of human vending machine for organs. So you're never going to have 100% of people agree with this policy. And then also Al talked about this moral repugnance point, so I won't go into that. And the other thing, and this is true on all parts of the donor benefit side, is that it affects a small and politically disempowered group, insofar as people who need kidney transplants are mostly poor people of color, and are also very sick and so unable to politically advocate effectively. And so the upshot, I think, is also just that, if you're a politician, why would you use your limited time and political capital to work on this cause? It's going to be controversial. It's probably not going to get you a lot of public attention. It's for a group that's not going to give you a lot of money and doesn't have a lot of political power anyway. And also it becomes this vicious cycle where, everyone's expectations shape what the game is, right? So if you think, oh, well, other people aren't going to find this worth doing as politicians, then you yourself aren't going to want to do this. But then there's this other problem, which is, what about reimbursement for live donor expenses? That's not controversial. There's a broad consensus into it. And there's a good political scientist named Mancure Olson that I was taught in law school, and wrote this book called The Logic of Collective Action. And what he says is basically that, the easiest political things to get done are things that have concentrated benefits among a small amount of actors. So those actors kind of internalize the incentive to lobbying. So for example, there are 2 dialysis companies that control 80% of the market, and in this kind of highly regulated industry. When they spend money on lobbying, they get to internalize a lot of the benefits. On the other hand, this doesn't really happen in the transplant field. So one reason is because professional societies are kind of the dominant advocacy groups in this field, but they're not really very efficient political actors, partly for this reason. The benefits are diffused across, kind of all the different transplant surgeons in some sense, if you assume that surgeons do benefit, and the costs of actually doing advocacy are concentrated in the societies. And then also, the societies, there's not just, one dictator who says everything. It's this collective leadership that increases transaction costs and increases friction. And finally, they're not, lobbying isn't what professional societies do. And so they're more likely to be defensive and reactive and try to defend, what they already have, and not be aggressive about, we want to get new policies done. But the other thing is that the transplant centers themselves have serious limitations politically. The internal decision making is shared among a lot of different decision makers. And if you think about the interests of the surgeons, it's not actually, obviously everyone wants there to be more transplants, but it's not directly the idea that, the more transplants there are, the more profit there is to the surgeon. And then the more the surgeon wants to have, more they benefit, because they already get paid pretty well. More surgeries mean more work. So you don't have these kind of clean incentives that might lead to more advocacy and more energy behind this. I'm trying to switch to the next slide, but and so then I think also the patient groups haven't been able to really make a big difference here. I think that the idea of political advocacy can be a little bit tricky for nonprofits, because a nonprofit like the National Kidney Foundation, their value that they get is in having this brand and having this kind of universal consensus behind what they're doing, but you don't actually need to accomplish anything, especially accomplish anything politically, to achieve that. And actually, if you do accomplish something, in some ways that can be actually kind of demotivating, because then people aren't fired up to do more. And so I think that has been some of the reason why you haven't seen stronger and more effective pushes from advocacy, from patient groups. So the idea of WaitListZero is on one hand, if we're representing donors, if donors can kind of have more power, then that will sort of lead the system to treat donors better and will help solve some of these things. And also the idea that we can try to be a focal point for lobbying and reduce collective action problems that way. And like I said, we've had some successes, most notably with the Trump administration. But I think there are limitations to this approach where, people don't like contacting their representatives. And they also, it's this kind of niche issue that's hard to get coverage for. It's kind of hard to work with stakeholders because everyone's kind of territorial and feels kind of weird giving up control. So I think, I feel glad about the work we've done, and I'm definitely very excited to see more of this. But also, this is something, I don't want to portray this as, we've solved this problem. It's very simple and easy. I want to kind of just explain in this talk sort of what are the challenges that exist. And so maybe we can brainstorm some creative ways to transcend those. Thanks, everyone.
We certainly, Thomas Peters was going to be asking some questions. Tom, you want to follow up on anything?
Well, I'd just like to start with Mr. Morrison, who did a great job of telling us why we can't do the legislative effort. But my question is, what can we do?
Well, I think that just because it's difficult to accomplish this doesn't mean that it's not worth trying. And, I've spent a number of years trying and making some progress. I think one question to consider is controversy a good or bad thing? Because I think I've always worked under the assumption that it's a bad thing, and that we should try to get consensus, and that's the easiest way forward. But the problem there is that it's then hard to get public attention, because attention is going to be driven by controversy. So one hypothesis could be, well, let's be really aggressive. If you think that what you really want is reimbursement or health insurance or trials of incentives, maybe you should just be really aggressive and push for something much more radical, like $100,000 of payments per donor. And then, that might get more coverage and attention. You might be able to get something smaller. So that's one thing. I think also just, frankly, just having a lot more money in the field might also be helpful and might also help some of those coordination problems between the different stakeholders. That definitely happened with CareDx as well.
Josh, to follow up on that, isn't one of the problems that all of the people who are moving in this direction are working in small groups? I mean, it's like you talking about New York. I mean, there's no coalition of people who are really pushing this.
Yeah, we developed a coalition of back a few years ago of about 15 different kind of smaller groups, and so the question is, well, why isn't that exactly helpful? And I think it's something, I think there's two aspects. I think one is a matter of resources. So these disconnected efforts, it's how well can they actually work together, and to have a central direction requires money. I think that's the reality of it. And then I think the other reality is that, like I said, the different stakeholders in the field don't have much of an incentive to work together. And so I think if you have a really strong, well-funded push, you might, and again, you saw this with the Immunobill and CareDx's efforts, where once CareDx really put in something like $1 million in lobbying, then after some foot dragging, they were able to get AST and ASTS and the NKF to be kind of rowing in sync. But that was really difficult, even given all the advantages they had. So I think you need a sort of more centralized effort, and particularly you need more energy, and energy means attention and funding.
All people in this community are not equal, in my judgment. And it's interesting when you spoke of the pro or the yeses and the nos. It happens that in this community, there is a small group of people who are very active. They write very well. Some of them are even from Harvard, your former alumni place. And the point is, they are totally, irrevocably opposed to this notion of giving the donor $1. And I don't understand why. I've asked a number of folks, why do they feel so strongly about this? As an economist, you'd say, gee, if there were more kidneys, there'd be more transplants, there'd be more demand for surgeons, the industry would expand, et cetera, something like that. But that never gets raised. I mean,
Phil,
the first time I
may I give a shot?
Sure.
May I give a shot to answer that? And Art can probably chime in. He and I are both old enough to remember that when we were residents, the gestalt of the transplant community was to do all donor care as an altruistic kind of endeavor, whether it was deceased donor circumstance, cadaver donor in those days, or living donor. There was a very strong push for the ethos of donation to be entirely altruistic. And so Frank Delmonico was a resident at the same time, as were others currently still involved in this question. And so we were brought up to believe by our mentors and frankly by ourselves for a long time that no money should change hands. And in 1984, with the Gore bill, that ethos was passed on to Al Gore. At the time I was a Tennessee resident, I worked on that a little bit. And Al Gore's response was interesting. He said that we ought to keep it altruistic, i.e., no financial consideration. However, he said, if that does not work, then we might try something else. But as everybody on this call knows, once something is placed in legislation and becomes law, it is extremely difficult to change. Art, is that your recollection?
Yeah, every ethical group that's considered this topic has concluded that there's no ethical reason. And if you look at it historically, every group that's considered it, including including NODA, or I mean Jim Childress, who's one of the major bioethics people who's written about it, Institute of Medicine, have repeatedly said, if everything else isn't working, we should think about incentives. And clearly everything isn't working. The people who object say they want to try something more. Let's wait another 20 years and see what happens. But as all of us on the call know, we've waited that 20 years and 30 years and 40 years, and there's still people dying on the waiting list. And as Frank McCormick alluded to, there's tens of thousands of people who are eligible transplant candidates who aren't even put on the waiting list. And so that need is even greater. And yet we're sitting in small groups instead of forming a unified coalition. And I don't know the answer to the question, but I do think that ought to be part of an answer, is to find out how to work together.
But the small group also applies to the people who are advocating forcefully to not change the law. I mean, as we all know, there's a few people who write very effective letters, and when the government gets a letter from some surgeon from Harvard and says, you shouldn't do this or do that, that's taken pretty seriously. And
Bill, you got to give up on the Harvard. You're outnumbered on this call.
Well, I shouldn't be so careful. I'm retiring tomorrow, okay? And but at any rate, I want to tell a story. The first time I saw Art Emeritus was a debate at Hopkins, in which it was on this very topic of compensating or somehow gifting the donor. Art was not on the debate team. He was in the audience. And he stood up after it was all these academics back and forth and so forth. And he said, none of you are giving me anything I can say to my patients who come to me for care and cure. And let me tell you, the place was absolutely silent. And as far as I was concerned, man, this guy is really convincing. And apparently everybody in the audience agreed with him. But there hasn't been any change since that time. I mean, it's still the case that it's, among the professionals in this, oh man, we can't get into financial incentives for patients. I don't understand why.
I think part of it is the government doesn't want doctors, arguing in front of them. And I think that we need to provide a consensus, including the patients and their caretakers, who can effectively argue. If you were a government representative and you were getting letters from both sides, it may be harder to make up your mind. I've always said what we need is somebody in charge of the government who's got a family member with kidney disease. And when the Minister of Health, or you say it's CareDx, but it also was that Azar had a family member with kidney disease, and that's when there was a little bit of progress.
Well, and we've had a vice president get a heart transplant.
That's true.
Doesn't seem to have helped. And years ago, Art, I think you'll remember this also, a senator named Jake Garn gave a kidney to his daughter. And for a year or two, Jake Garn was the darling of the National Kidney Foundation. Nobody remembers.
But okay, let's take the National Kidney Foundation. I mean, as far as I know, they're opposed to compensating the donor. I mean, here's a group that supposedly doesn't have, they're not running a dialysis unit. They don't have big financial interest in this. They're supposed to be talking about care for patients. How can the National Kidney Foundation wind up being opposed to
Well, actually,
gifting
they flipped
donors?
it, Bill. I was a trustee years and years ago in the early 90s. I was an NKF trustee, had chaired a number of committees. And I convinced the trustees to take a position in favor of pilot studies for financial incentives in DC donation. That's what the conversation was then. The National Kidney Foundation did adopt that, i.e., favorably disposed to studies to determine outcome. And then I left as a trustee, and others came on, and those others are some names that we would recognize. They were strongly against financial incentives. Among the trustees at the time, as I recall, was a Carmelite nun, and the Catholic Church has had, as you may know, Phil, some difficulty with the idea of commodification of organs. And so the Kidney Foundation about 15 years ago changed course and has stood staunchly against even the study of financial incentives. And of course, the reason anybody is against a study is they know what the results will be. People are against this not because they are against the study of something. They're against it because they know if a substantial financial reward is offered in a study, the study will show that it works.
Okay, this will be my last question. What was controversial about this symposium today? Okay, I'm getting a flash. We've got to end this. Sorry. Could we go to a couple of concluding graphics, which we can say that thank you. Here you see all these good folks, and we will be communicating, of course, with you afterward. We do plan a peer review publication. Next slide, please, with Dr. Ojo will be doing that. These are the people who have been really very, very influential, helpful, every one of them, not the least of which has been the generous contribution of NKDO and WaitListZero to make this possible. Here's Dr. Ojo and with Holly, I believe. At any rate, Dr. Ojo is committed to producing a peer-reviewed publication. And as I said, we will be producing films and audio of all the today's show, which you will be able to receive through NKDO. I think that's it. Any further points? I'm absolutely grateful to all of you people, and it was, I think we really pointed to doing some good in the world. But as the last session indicated, it's not new and it's not much indication that it will have any effect, but let's hope. Thank you. You're a wonderful, wonderful group of people, and I'm proud to be associated with you, as I know all my co-authors, and Dr. Fung is the same, who is unfortunately not here. Thank you very much.